Here's a typical example of the kind of dashboard reporting you get from a CRM. In this case, the pipeline value, or what's often called the weighted pipeline value, is $28.3 million, generating a forecast of $4.47 million. There's a pipeline value per salesperson, and you get a snapshot of the pipeline by stage, based on a rolling 12 months, though it's never entirely clear what that rolling 12 months really means. The point here is, on any given Monday morning, when you look at these numbers, you might conclude that there's plenty happening in the pipeline and assume there's enough to make the month. This is a "we're generally okay" picture. What often happens, though, is that while individual deals get discussed in meetings, the reliability of that forecast number doesn't get the scrutiny it deserves. Certainly not at what we call a bet your salary standard. In some businesses, these dashboards work just fine because things are stable. There's a solid amount of recurring or renewal business, and enough new business flows in so that when you add everything up, you hit your numbers. In those cases, the CRM reporting works more or less by default, because a lot of those numbers will come in no matter what. But the commercial world we operate in doesn't exist in that kind of rarefied air. Our clients are usually in growth, scaling, or innovation mode. They're often not the leader in their category at the global level, so they cannot take their eye off the ball for a second. That means each week they've got to dig into what the pipeline is really telling them and get to a more accurate forecast as early as possible in the month or quarter. The challenge is how to get that level of clarity from a CRM, especially when the data seems to mean different things depending on who's looking at it. If we were to look at the numbers here, our immediate conclusion would be that the real forecast is probably a lot closer to the $0.47 million range, and that the $4 million currently in the forecast is unlikely. At least most of it won't arrive this month, especially with the clock ticking. So how do you get a CRM to tell you not just how much revenue might come in, but also what isn't going to close? The answer lies in introducing the idea of distance to revenue into your CRM and sales reporting framework. Once you introduce the concept of distance to revenue, you'll be able to quickly sort out the stages, labels, probabilities, and reporting in your CRM. Let's dig into that. Notice what we've achieved using the sales architecture approach. We've taken the forecast of 4.47 million and distributed it across the forecast stages: red, amber, and green. This is represented in the row marked number 2. The row marked number 1 is what the CRM dashboard implies, so the forecast number is far less likely to get stress tested. When people see 4.47 million on a CRM dashboard, their instinct is to interpret that as the forecast, essentially the amount of revenue expected to come in this month, more or less. However, when we view it through what we call a distance to revenue lens, the issue becomes apparent. Much of that forecasted revenue still has a long way to go, and in this case, we're saying 3 million, or the majority, is still in the red zone, meaning it's far from closing. In fact, only 10% of that total number is anywhere near completion, while 2/3 have the longest distance to travel. Completion time is now the challenge. This illustrates the core issue with CRM dashboards. They present a number, or what we refer to as abundance, but they don't show the distance that revenue still needs to cover, nor do they highlight the inherent risk that some of it might not close in time, against the clock. Numbers on their own can be misleading, whether in a spreadsheet or a CRM, and what works far better in sales is a visualized distribution of where the portfolio of opportunities, and specifically the forecasted ones, actually sit. This way, you can quickly spot if there's a potential risk to your revenue. The further the distance to revenue, the higher the risk, especially as the month or quarter progresses. If the scenario in the row marked number 2 were reality on the 15th day of the month, there'd be a lot of ground to cover in the remaining 2 weeks. And if it were a quarter's forecast, and you were halfway through the final month, there'd be a mountain to climb. This is why your CRM must not only reflect distance to revenue, but do so accurately and early in the forecast period. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a nasty surprise, and often a stressful end-of-month or quarter scramble. While the sales world tends to celebrate hitting the finish line, underneath that success lies immense accumulated stress, both for the people involved and for the business as a whole. This kind of pressure prevents true growth or scaling in a way that's sustainable and manageable. The key to solving all of this starts with getting your CRM to work better for the business. The strong recommendation we would make is that if you're not already doing so, you switch on the board or Kanban board feature in your CRM. This is a tool that's become widely recognized in project management and software, and it's increasingly making its way into sales. The board you're seeing on the screen is from Salesforce.com, and it's based on the version we implemented back in 2010. However, it's taken about 15 years for it to become more commonly used. Now, when we introduce this board to sales teams, the initial reaction is often, "Oh, it's just another dashboard." But in reality, it's an entirely fresh and insightful approach to managing sales. It fundamentally shifts how you operate because you're no longer just managing a revenue figure, you're managing a portfolio of opportunities, which causes a much greater focus on activity, quality of activity, and planned actions. The image we have here is what we call the ideal formation. An ideal pipeline will naturally take on a triangular shape because deals are always falling off, stalling, or being lost. Everything we teach about sales architecture is built around this idea of the board. If you keep this image in mind, all the other concepts on this platform will fall into place. And the beauty of this is that you can switch it on tomorrow morning and start using it, not just as another dashboard, but as a powerful tool for strategic pipeline management and forecasting. This board is a perfect example of highlighting a high risk to revenue. You can immediately see the massive gaps, not just in pipeline and forecast, but in the realized revenue as well. The critical insight here is that it's almost impossible to isolate this type of risk just by looking at a list of opportunities or the typical pipeline, forecast, and revenue numbers, as we saw on the first slide. This approach is a true breakthrough in managing pipeline risk, avoiding the distraction of what might look like an abundance of opportunities, which can essentially amount to gambling. Sales is a probability game, and the odds are either working for you or against you. It's the responsibility of the manager and the team to make sure those odds are predictable and stacked in your favor. That's why your CRM pipeline view needs to show you at all times how far each salesperson is from their ideal pipeline. Every salesperson has an ideal pipeline that they need to maintain, and that's the core function of your CRM, to keep you aligned with that. The notes, charts, workflows, and integrations are useful, but they're secondary to the job of isolating risk and supporting better decision-making each week. Optimizing a CRM to genuinely support sales can be quite challenging. It requires an architectural mindset to effectively structure the pipeline workflow and board, along with implementing reporting mechanisms that allow for easy identification of revenue risks on a weekly basis. Our program, rooted in our own sales architecture, has successfully helped hundreds of companies enhance their CRM systems. This process isn't about extensive reconfiguration or extensive customization. Instead, it typically involves some strategic adjustments, refining the pipeline workflow, clarifying stage definitions, establishing a clear understanding of what we mean by a forecast, and enhancing views and reports. It also encourages the team to adopt a new perspective on their pipeline portfolio and recognize the implications of effective pipeline management for revenue generation. Your CRM then becomes a tool for hardwiring a risk-based discipline into your sales thinking that will set a better weekly pace.